It's a story so rich in intrigue that if it were fiction, it would likely be a bestseller, because all of the dead, almost 24 to date, worked in Western Europe's defense industry.
And the deaths, some bizarre by any standards, have been scattered across the continent. Only by chance did the pattern emerge. But the question is obvious. Is this all just coincidence, or has international espionage produced a string of murders?
In early 1987, Tony Collins, a journalist working for a trade publication, Computer News, received a tip, one that would lead him into a world eerily similar to a James Bond thriller. It started with two bizarre deaths. The first was Vimal Dajibai, a 24-year-old computer engineer from Watford, United Kingdom. In August of 1986, instead of meeting a friend after work, Vimal inexplicably drove over 2 hours to Bristol. He parked his car near the Clifton Suspension Bridge, and hours later, his body was found smashed below it, his trousers around his ankles, and a strange puncture mark on his thigh. Police said he plunged off the bridge, but his family and friends disagreed. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary in his life. A month later, another computer scientist, Ashad Sharif, also left London for Bristol. This time, he tied a rope to a tree, the other end around his neck, and accelerated his car forward, decapitating himself. On the floor of the vehicle, investigators found a metal rod, seemingly used to jam the gas pedal down. A local coroner, unsettled by the similarities, speculated about a possible James Bond connection between the two deaths. When journalist Tony Collins started to investigate these, he discovered something chilling. Both men had worked on top-secret defense projects for gec-Marconi, a major British defense contractor deeply involved in the United States Strategic Defense Initiative, better known as the Star Wars program, a multi-billion-dollar plan to build a space-based missile defense system against Soviet nuclear weapons. Collins published his article, not realizing he had just opened the Pandora's box. What followed was a series of investigations by prominent journalists that uncovered a pattern. Between 1982 and 1989, more than 20 defense industry scientists and engineers across the UK and Europe died under mysterious and often gruesome circumstances. Many were linked to gec-Marconi, all of them involved in classified military tech, and many of their deaths came back as open verdicts, meaning we have no idea what happened. The emerging theory was that these deaths were part of a covert plan to silence some of the brightest minds in the defense industry. For what purpose? Well, let's find out. The first in this chilling chain of deaths was Dr. Keith Bowden, a senior computer scientist working for gec-Marconi. In March of 1982, after leaving a social event in London, he was involved in a car accident and died instantly. Police called it drunk driving, but his family and lawyers disagreed. Friends at the party said he hadn't been drinking that night, and when they hired a private investigator to examine the wreck, they found someone had swapped Bowden's near-new tires with a worn-out set. Then came Roger Hill in 1985, dead from an apparent self-inflicted shotgun wound. Later that same year, another Marconi digital communications expert fell to his death from a hotel window in West Africa. Cause of death, open verdict. By 1988, the list contained more than 24 deaths, some of them extremely disturbing. One particularly was John Ferry, a Marconi director who was found dead after he jammed stripped electrical wires into his own teeth and electrocuted himself. Again, some of these deaths are extremely gruesome and disturbing, and I don't want to get into too much detail on them. You can check the list for yourself, I've attached it below. But the main gist of it is that many of these deaths came back as open verdicts, and those that didn't were highly suspicious. A pattern was evident. All of the victims worked in the defense industry. Most were tied in some way to gec-Marconi, and nearly all had connections, direct or peripheral, to the United States Strategic Defense Initiative, the so-called Star Wars program. To truly understand what happened to these people, we have to look at the broader context. These deaths happened during the height of the Cold War, a time when a nuclear conflict felt dangerously close. The United States and the Soviet Union were racing to build better weapons, and technology had become the key to winning the war. The Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars for its futuristic ambitions, was launched by President Reagan in 1983. The idea was to use satellites, lasers, and other space-based technology to shoot down Soviet nuclear missiles before they could reach its target. The government invested around $30 billion into the program, but despite the massive funding, the technology simply wasn't feasible. In 1993, President Clinton officially shut it down. However, during its run, one of the companies heavily involved in building the Star Wars system was gec-Marconi. However, it's important to note that the trail of deaths connected to the Star Wars program wasn't only exclusive to the United Kingdom and Marconi. In West Germany, car bombs killed several figures tied to SDI. In Sweden and Italy, defense scientists met similarly suspicious ends. The question loomed, were these deaths coincidences, or were they part of a wider, deliberate plot to silence prominent defense industry figures? One explanation is that there's nothing suspicious about these deaths whatsoever. Yes, the scientists work for Marconi, but they didn't really know each other. Thousands of people were employed in the British defense industry at the time, so 24 deaths over more than a decade could be coincidence. High-stress job, long hours, secretive work, these are all conditions that can seriously impact mental health. And that was the mainstream theory pushed by British authorities. There was nothing to look there. These were all accidents or coincidences. But this view was far from unchallenged. Professor Colin Pritchard, a specialist in mental illness and depression, argues that some of these deaths were statistically unusual. We're talking violent, bizarre deaths that don't fit the usual profile. None of the victims showed prior signs of distress or depression, and for instance, some of these were extremely bizarre. Like this one guy was found wedged under his car with his mouth jammed into the exhaust pipe. Even the police didn't buy it. They said it was impossible that he wedged himself into that position alone. I mean, how stressed do you need to be to decide, I'm gonna jam my mouth into that exhaust pipe? Look, I do think some of these deaths were self-inflicted or accidents, but all of them, I don't think so. When it comes to Cold War-era murders, the usual suspects are the Soviets. It's entirely possible the KGB targeted these individuals either to disrupt Western defense projects or to extract classified intel, and there's more than one reason to suspect that. Some of these scientists weren't just working on the Star Wars program. They were also linked to Project Cosmos, which dealt with underwater guidance systems. That creates a plausible connection between their work and Soviet interest. We know Soviet intelligence did target foreign scientists from time to time, especially those tied to sensitive military or intelligence research. Personally, I do think some of these deaths could be explained by this theory. Certainly the car bombings in West Germany and the deaths in Sweden and Italy, but that doesn't explain the rest. You know, the KGB had a playbook, maybe a little bit of poison, some simple stage accidents or disappearances. Not whatever happened to those two guys in Bristol. The cases of Vimal and Ashad, they were found dead in incredibly strange circumstances. If Soviets wanted them gone, why go through the trouble of dragging them across the country and staging some convoluted scene? They had far simpler and more proven methods. Poison them, shoot them, done. This was something else. And that's why the KGB theory only goes so far. Now, the darkest theory of them all is that these scientists were taken care of by their own governments or employers. There's a strange pattern to these deaths I haven't mentioned. Allegedly, several of the victims landed new jobs and were planning to leave days before their deaths. Even more suspicious, 4 of them scheduled appointments with their members of parliaments. None of them made it to it. So what were they trying to say? Maybe they've uncovered something, and maybe they were silenced before they could talk or escape. I don't usually leap straight to conspiracies, but I'll be honest, this theory doesn't seem that far-fetched. Some of these deaths weren't just violent, they were almost ritualistic, gruesome. If you wanted to send a message to the employees of the defense industry, that's one hell of a way to do it. But here's the hard truth about all of this. We don't have solid or substantial evidence to back any of this. Nothing conclusive, nothing that ties all of those deaths together. And if I had to guess, I would say that there is no common cause behind all of these deaths. It's a mix. Some of the deaths were likely self-inflicted or accidents. A few probably were foreign intelligence operations, KGB, maybe others. And yeah, I think it's entirely possible that some of them were silenced by their own side. The media, though, they bundled them all together. They tried to find a common cause to all of them. And when you do that, when you take a handful of tragedies, a few murders, and a couple of corporate political silencing cases, and mix them all into one, you end up with something that reads like a Cold War thriller. Maybe the real answer is more fragmented, more human, and harder to tie into a neat package. Anyway, that's my theory. I don't know, what do you think? Drop your comments down below what you think really happened to these people. I read all of the comments and I would be very interested in knowing what your opinion is. Thank you for watching.